Steve has over 3 decades of experience working in natural lands management, environmental planning, and community engagement. Steve holds a master's degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he studied and surveyed butterflies, and he's remained an active butterfly enthusiast. Steve recently co-authored the Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Health Study for the Department of Natural Resources, leading Xerces assessment and development for best management practices. And folks, that piece there, the health study, gave rise to 241117, which gave CPW the right to govern and recognize invertebrates as wildlife, and also to recognize rare plants. And we have Elliot Gordon with us. He is a geotechnical engineer in New Mexico and a volunteer ambassador for the Xerces Society. He likes to photograph all of the wildlife in his pollinator garden, which features over 140 species of native plants that have attracted 1,630 species of insects and counting. He is also an amateur entomologist studying rare group of native bee parasites called wedge-shaped beetles, an iNaturalist addict, and a big fan of Monarch's Mirkwood bull. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And folks, if you want to turn your cameras off and sit back and relax, we've agreed to take your questions in the chat, and then we will periodically address them. And real quick, Ronnie, you're technically in the Denver chapter, but you're welcome to elect for both chapters. And I'll put my email in the chat, so you could just email me and I'll put you in both of those folders. Your chapter selection dictates how many, what emails you're getting about events. All right, thank you.
Okay, great. I'll pick up from there. And thank you all for having both Elliot and I this evening. I didn't realize initially when I agreed to do this that it was the inaugural, so this is even more of an honor. I will be running the slideshow, and Elliot and I will be kind of going ping-ponging back and forth between the presentation. So this is also a first chance for me to work with Elliot. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And Elliot, at some point, I want to see your garden with 140 plants. That sounds pretty impressive. So as Wendy said, or Maggie said, sorry, please put your questions in the chat. We'll hopefully save time at the end to get to various questions that may come up or you may have had over time. Okay. So what we hope to cover this evening, and we may go in a few stray directions as well, but overall, we'd love to share some information about why we want to talk about, why we care about pollinators, and kind of as an example of why we should care about other insects as well. To speak a little bit about pollinators and native bee diversity. So just when we think about pollinators, what are we really thinking about? Dive a little deeper, not too much, but a little deeper just on some of our native bees, so you can kind of be able to understand some of the diversity or the differentiation between different types of bees, and a little of the natural history, and touch base on threats and conservation as well, as we kind of make sure we all are thinking about what we can do to help our pollinators. Before I go too deep, though, I did want to just say a little bit about the Xerces Society. So we're an invertebrate conservation organization that's been around for over 50 years. Our name is a little different, but it's actually named after a small blue butterfly, the Xerces blue butterfly, that was last seen flying in 1943 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so our organization, the founder of it, Robert Pyle, who is actually a Denver native who no longer lives here, but certainly is connected to many of the people that study butterflies in the Colorado area. He wanted to start an organization that wouldn't, be dedicated basically to hopefully doing work that would prevent other butterflies from going extinct, and wanted to name it after the Xerces blue to keep that in mind of what we're all trying to strive for. So we are literally an international nonprofit organization, although most of our work does focus here in the US, and we have staff across the country that really our focus is doing work to conserve invertebrates by basically making sure we're conserving their habitats. So work we all do together. So our work really focuses on conservation, all sorts of working with land managers, from individual residents to large government agencies, to doing work towards advocacy. So what can we do to engage where necessary in policy work within ways to help us all try to make sure we have practices that address pollinator conservation. We do research work to understand more about invertebrates and what's important in their habitat, and then share information. Example of what Elliot and I are doing for you this evening. So we don't do this work alone, whether it's, our ambassadors, our staff. We have an incredible number of partners that help us out as well. We have a bunch of members of the Xerces Society. We have many scientists that participate in the work we do. We have a lot of state, federal, local agencies, and even businesses and companies that all kind of participate in various ways to support the work that is underway to help think about and conserve pollinators. So appreciate you engaging with the Xerces Society this evening to understand a little bit more about pollinators. So the fundamental question is why should we even care? Why do we want to think about what's important about pollinators? And again, there's probably information here that you're all somewhat familiar with, but I think it's always good just to keep it in mind, is that, first and foremost, between the plants and the invertebrates, and especially the pollinators, they're the foundation for the conservation of our habitats, of our resources. They're kind of the linchpin that helps everything else function well from an ecosystem standpoint. We think about plant reproduction. 85% of our flowering plants are requiring some sort of pollinator to move the pollen back and forth to help fertilize flowers. So incredibly important with the regeneration, the reproduction of our vegetative communities, and also then all the other life that's supported by those communities. And when we think about life, we're thinking about our own lives as well, that when we eat food, in fact, 1 in 3 mouthfuls of our food probably or the drink we consumed are, being helped along by the fact of pollinators doing their work. In terms of our agricultural production alone, over $30 billion worth of crops in North America can be thanked or contributed to the work of pollinators. I love this work that Whole Foods did in collaboration with Xerces and others, was to think about just kind of, as you walk through the produce aisle of a grocery store, the number of different ways pollinators touch many of the food items that are available in our vegetable and fruit aisles. And if you removed those items that were a product of an insect pollinator, it would look pretty bare. And I think that just brings to mind again kind of why it is something we want to be thinking about, why these little animals have such an important and maybe oversized role in the world they play for us. But it's not even just for us, not even just for plants, it's for, again, that whole other level of trophic organisms that are out there when we think about the fruits and the seeds that comprise the diets for so many different birds or animals that are dependent upon the fruits of our vegetation, or even the large animals such as bears that certainly need the calories to be able to hibernate. And the insects themselves, the pollinators, the larvae, maybe the caterpillars, they're food themselves for many different variety of wildlife itself. So, there's ongoing kind of all sorts of value from the ecosystem levels that benefit from the fact of pollinators doing their job. And they make our lives, whether it's when we go to the grocery store, or frankly, when we have events that help kind of define our seasons or enrich our lives, whether that's, thinking about the fact that a pollinator had to do its work to make sure we have pumpkins out for Halloween, or we were able to eat a pumpkin pie, or just really the intrinsic value of pollinators that bring to our lives when we think about how amazing it is to see a bumblebee buzz by or a butterfly fly by. I think someone shared at the beginning, that they actually saw their first butterfly of the year. So it's always one of those amazing things to see a pollinator on wing and to start, appreciating the work they're doing for us and what they represent. I'll switch over. Elliot, your turn.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, we have a lot of pollinators to talk about. So we're going to try and give you an idea of all the insects that do pollination. And then Steve's going to talk a little more in depth about the native bees. So our main groups of pollinators here, and this is just a sampling of examples, but the kind of animals you generally think about are the common flower visitors. So we have butterflies and moths, we have hoverflies and wasps, in addition to bees, of course. And then there's also bats and sometimes some beetles and hummingbirds even. So, we've got a lot of different pollinators. Next. And we're going to focus on bees. That's a great Penstemon photo there, Steve. We're going to focus on bees because they're the ones that are visiting flowers most consistently, and especially visiting flowers of the same species back to back. So as they're traveling for nectar or pollen, they are going to move those pollen grains more efficiently than, say, a butterfly or a beetle that isn't so picky about what flower it goes to. And the two main ways that pollen is transported is wet and dry. Our honeybees and our bumblebees, they tend to take wet pollen, which might have some nectar mixed in or some bee saliva, essentially. And that's why their legs always look a little bit sticky and like there's just a glob of pollen on them. And the rest of the insects generally find a way to, the larger bees, they tend to gather the pollen with their legs and kind of push it into those hairs that are either on their back legs or on the underside of their abdomen. Some of the smaller bees actually just bite it off with their mouths and then kind of move it around on their bodies so they can fly it back to their nest. And we made this slide always brings up questions. So it's kind of it's the stance of the Xerces Society. It's also just a general fact in North America that honeybees are not typical bees and they're not native bees. And what we're going to focus on are those native bees and pollinators, because honeybees are generally managed by beekeepers and used for, in general, for agriculture, for large scale pollination of orchards and farms. So it can be a bit tricky when you're out and you see something buzz by. Maybe it's coming at your face and you don't really care if it's a bee or a wasp. But when we're looking at things on flowers, the general rules, and there's lots of exceptions to these rules, which we could talk about all day. That could be a whole nother presentation. The general rules are that bees are hairy, and that hair tends to be in places like their legs and the underside of their abdomen where they can carry pollen. Wasps tend to be kind of that mean looking, sleek, narrow waisted body structure. There's certainly wasps come in all sizes from a millimeter up to, up to a couple centimeters or so. So there's lots of variation here in this pretty diverse group, but that's a general guideline. It can be a little bit harder when we're talking about bees and flies, because some of the flies have developed into really good mimics, especially the hover flies like the one here on the right. So if you're able to get up close enough, flies have two wings. Their order is Diptera or Diptera, so for two wings, whereas bees actually have two pairs of wings, a forewing and a hindwing on each side. But usually you can't really see both sets of the bee's wings. So you're going to look for those hairs again. You're going to look for kind of the shape and the structure of the eyes and even the antenna. The flies tend to have pretty short antenna mounted more lower on the face, and bee antenna tend to be what you're more used to, like on the left there. And as far as our native bees go, and we're going to show you lots of pictures of lots of different groups of native bees. The general rule, except for a few exceptions, which we'll cover, they're going to be solitary, which means the female bee you see is her own queen, essentially. She provisions the nest, she lays eggs, she does all those roles that are divided in a honeybee colony. And they are unlikely to sting. I will say I have had the pleasure of being stung by multiple species of native bees, some because I was messing with them and some because they were messing with me. But you really have to do a lot to provoke them to sting. And it's not a barbed stinger like a honeybee where it gets stuck in you and the bee dies. It's like a little jab and then the bee flies off. And I think we're going back to Steve now.
Great. And when we try to think about or wrestle with the diversity amongst our native bees, we've got a pretty incredible range to work from. And this kind of gives you just a sense of scale from a worldwide perspective down to perhaps maybe thinking just about the Arkansas Valley itself. So across the globe, there are approximately 20,000 species of bees. And again, even I know amongst the floral taxonomy, again, things are constantly shifted and we're shifting and we're always learning new things. So that's why all these are very much kind of best known estimates at this time. There's approximately 4,000 species in North America. Here in Colorado, just recent work to update some of the cataloging through the University of Colorado Museum. We have about 1,006 different species that we now know of. And again, that changes pretty consistently. There's estimates with about 660 different bee species along the Front Range. And this is just a speculation, but I'm kind of using that Front Range estimate to maybe think, just alone within your region of the Arkansas Valley, we're probably considering 400 to 500-ish, although I wouldn't be surprised if it goes higher than that. Different types of bees that you could encounter all throughout the various ecosystems you have in the valley. But mixed in with all of our many native bee species, there are non-native species too that have entrenched themselves in our ecosystem. Certainly, again, bringing in the honeybee is one of those, but then there's other leaf-cutting bees, mason bees, et cetera, too, that have moved in. So while it's not a huge issue with many non-native bees moving in, it is something we see just as more opportunities arise for bees to be moved between different continents or certainly between different areas, or just as they themselves expand and change habitats through their own kind of movement between spaces. So when we think too about native bee diversity, it ranges from, incredible varieties in colors, from what you see here is one of the really radiant green sweat bees, to size differences, something as small as a tiny little, fairy bee, that's the tip of a pin compared to a very large bumblebee or carpenter bee, kind of the larger bee you see there. So size is certainly a range of variability that helps in that diversity. And then there's also behaviors and the ways bees have found different niches within their environment. In fact, too, where you have kleptoparasites, where some bees are taking advantage, somewhat like the cowbirds taking advantage of other bees' efforts to lay eggs and going in and parasitizing those eggs to lay their own larvae and hopefully have their larvae grow up based upon all the work that another bee has done to support an egg and a eventual larvae. And so there's certainly a lot of variety that we have to contend with. And I'm gonna kind of jump through some different families and some genuses of bees with, no expectation that anybody's probably gonna really be able to dive deep and understand this, but it'll give you a sense a little bit about the range of different types of bees you're probably encountering as you're out looking at flowers indoor, just working around vegetation as you're out exploring both maybe your home gardens or out in natural areas. And this is not inclusive of all the families that are out there, or certainly, the range of diversity, but it'll give you a sense of some of our common groups of bees that you'll encounter. One I just want to raise up is the family of the Pollinators. These are our plaster or yellow-faced bees. They're can be told apart somewhat if you ever happen to be able to look at one under a microscope. You can see kind of a bilobe tongue, and many bees actually you are required to look at them under microscopes oftentimes to be able to tell the difference. But this family of bees is also kind of known as the cellophane bees. They line their reproductive cells where the egg and the larvae are going to grow with secretions, or kind of look like cellophane often. And within that then is a genus, the Cleides, that are able to kind of seal off nest tunnels with this substance it's kind of a resin. And it's a fairly large group of bees. There's 36 Colorado species of it. They are typically, like Elliot said, most of them are ground nesting. So these are kind of solitary and ground nesting bees that we have. They may be pollen specialists, but some of the generalists also are common within this group, which is typical within many of the bees. Some may be some of a genus may be more specialized to certain genus of plants or even species of plants. Others may be more broadly to a bunch of different floral families. They tend to be smaller bees that you may see. And oftentimes I'll look for the Cleides out on my willows when they're first out at bloom here. And the other thing that oftentimes helps separate bees, and again, you many times need to look at a microscope to be able to tell this apart, but the venation of the wing structure of bees often kind of helps to provide clues as to separate one genus from another, one family from another, and oftentimes again one species from another. Another group, another genus within the Cleididae are the Hylias, so the yellow-faced bees. So we have a few less species of this bees, but most of these are cavity twig nesting bees, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different kind of ways that bees, the natural history of the way bees nest. But these are some of our common twig nesting bees. So if we're leaving vegetation in place with, hollow stems, you may be able to see, the little yellow-faced bees making use of that. And kind of, again, a fun little bee to be able to watch and see, especially in and around our gardens. The Halictidae are the sweat bees. So these are probably one of the most common bees you're going to encounter in around most spaces, especially in many of our urban environments. They've seem to be quite compatible with can be higher levels of disturbed areas, and they're may be able to forage on a variety of different plants. There's over 139 species, so many kind of different varieties. Some of these can have more social behaviors to them. They may be nesting in the ground in nearby nests with one another, or actually use same tunnel entrance, but then have separate tunnels off of that entrance that they raise their young in. And again, some differentiation is possible by looking at the venation of the wings that may help. The Halictus is another group genus, and of the sweat bees. These are often kind of the black and white abdomen striped small little bees. Again, these are ground nesting bees. There's a few species of them, not as many overall as some of the other sweat bees. But one of the ways, again, to separate these out is by looking for hair bands at the edge of the abdominal segments. So where that hair, if they have hair along the abdomen, where it comes off of the segment can be oftentimes a diagnostic element of the halictus. And then the lasioglossum, these are, again, can be very colorful sweat bees. And, you know, many of them, again, overall, the sweat bees are, again, some of our smaller bees. We have 89 species. So of all the Halictidae, the lasioglossum can be, you know, again, one that you more commonly may come across. They are solitary. They do have some of the cuckoo bee parasites that are a part of this group. And they may be, you know, more specialized to some flowers or very broad-based, very generalist in some of the ones they may choose to look for nectar or pollen sources on. And rather than the halictid, this is, you can see here, the hair comes off at a different point of the segments. The Adrenidae is a large family of bees. These are kind of what we think about our mining bees. There's over 230 species here in Colorado, and many of these can be some of our most specialist bees. And so there are many that kind of may use a single family of plants or maybe just a few families of different plants in their search for pollen and nectars. And these are very, very solitary bees. The Adrena themselves, there's over 144 species, and range in colors from, you know, as you can see here, some red abdomens to, you know, getting some greener coloration to yellows. So they can be quite different in the color appearances you may be able to see. Kind of one of the key identifiers for the Adrena is they have these kind of concave depressions in their heads that are oftentimes very furry, and is one of the key ways you can separate an Adrena from many of the other bees that might look somewhat similar. Some of my favorites are the Megachilidae. These are our leaf cutting or our resin pebble bees. There's 232 species. These are the ones that carry their pollen on the hairs, the scopa on their abdomen. And I think there's a picture like we showed earlier with, you know, you'll see them moving around and they'll actually pat their abdomen on the surface of a flower to be able to pick up and create ability to carry the pollen around. Within that, within the Megachilidae, we have, you know, some larger, the third Gyopsis, which, you know, oftentimes you'll see poking around on thistle. Well, here in Colorado, we only have one species. I know there's a couple more down in New Mexico in some warmer environments. We also have Dianthidium, which are some of our bees that actually, when they create their nests, they maybe put a bunch of tiny little pebbles together to create a little cavity that they'll lay their eggs within. So if you have a rock or something, you see kind of a bunch of tiny little pebbles look like they're glued together. That's often a result of a nest of a Dianthidium. They'll also use twigs and other cavities for nests as well. The Anthidium, or another name you'll hear for them, are the carder bees, the wool carder bees. They gather up the hairs off of plants that they use to line their nests with. And so oftentimes you'll see them moving across the surface of a leaf and actually, you know, with their mandibles scraping up or cutting off the hairs, balling that up, and then taking that back to a nest site. Some of our prettiest bees are all within the groups of the Hoplites, the Osmia, and other Megachile, where you get the radiant greens, the large. They tend to have these little bit larger oval abdomens to them. Many of them are, again, cavity nesters. You'll see many of the Osmia, the mason bees in nesting blocks if you have that, or in snags or other downed wood on the ground. these are the osmias, also known as kind of our orchard bees. So many times like to favor many of the fruit trees and some of the plants within the rose family. And the megachile, the leaf cutting bees, are always fascinating to see. So if you see a bee that's working and cutting out a leaf of a plant or maybe of a flower, it's using the petal or the leaf itself in that little cut circle to be able to provide a cell around an egg. So both the separator between different chambers in its nest, but also kind of protecting encircling that egg to help create a kind of a protected environment for that egg and that larvae to grow in, that help reduce, the exposure to changes in temperature, to changes in humidity, and hopefully other pathogens that might work in that cell. One of the largest groups of families is the Apidae. So these are our digger bees, the honeybees, the bumblebees. There's over 289 different species of apis bees. There are kind of a range here of, certainly with the honeybees and even with the bumblebees, some level of sociality to the bees, to also a range of some that are solitary or parasitic. And then our sunflower bees, the ones that anytime you spend time around some of the asters or sunflowers, you're likely to see, some of our Diadasia or Melissoides, the longhorn bees. These are especially the males that have an extra antennal segment. If you see a sunflower with a bee on it with incredibly large or what seems to be oversized antenna, it's most likely going to be a Melissoides, one of these longhorn bees. We've got 30 different species. Some of them are very specialist to our sunflowers. And the other sunflower specialist is the Sebastra. So there's 7 species of that. They all carry their pollen on these very large, hairy back legs they have. So if you see kind of the chaps, if you want to think about them, these big chaps being carried around out by a bee, you're probably looking at one of the Sebastra long-haired bees. And then what makes our, squash, our gourds so beautiful and healthy? It's the Pollinators bees. So these are our squash bees that are the best pollinators for our, pumpkins and any sort of curbitaceae that we have. So we're incredibly dependent upon those. And then last group I want to kind of follow up with, or near to last, is the digger bees, the Anthophora bees. So these are the ones that can be nesting in cut banks from a stream or a cliff. They can sometimes make fairly intricate tunnels or entrances to their tunnels. Many of them can be a little larger, fairly hairy when you see them, but fascinating when you see the colonies of them. And so if you're kind of looking at an embankment and you see a bunch of tiny holes in that embankment, it's oftentimes well worth your time to kind of hang out and wait a little bit to see if in fact there may be a bee that's utilizing that space there. Within the apis too are our bumblebees, our bombus. There's 24 different species here in Colorado, with several of them, in decline and in an imperiled state. So a group that we are very alert to, and I know we'll, as part of your next talk at the next meeting, we'll certainly talk about some of the work underway to learn more about bumblebees. But these are can be a social bee in the sense that they, an annual hive is established, but only the queen is the only one that's overwintering. And so, this is a bee that does represent some level of sociality to it. Is you've got a hive that works together to raise basically the next batch of queens that'll continue the generation. And so, within Bombus itself, there's an incredible range of variation. It's oftentimes a group, even though there's 24, I feel like you can start getting your hand around it. Then you have to realize that there's, no matter what, high levels of variability within some of the different species that we have here. Then there's variations between what a female bee male may look like compared to a male bee, and then also between a queen and the workers, and even seasonally they may change. So getting to know bees can be a bit of a challenge. It's always kind of a fun place to start with one group that, like the bumblebees, that may have a few less variety, but still within that, there's often a large range of changes you have to go through to look at and understand. And I think some of the most exciting thing when we think about this diversity is how, again, this range of different bee families and genera, the species we have out on the supporting our natural environments in our gardens, really kind of fit together with the landscape and the plants that occur in that landscape. And so there's a lot of work that's underway to really look at, okay, what plants in fact are certain bee genera or families, relating to, and looking at kind of a visualization or a network that's created around this. And this is some work that, if there's the website link here, that you can look at and start playing with, just to look at groups to see which perhaps different types of flowers a particular group of bees may be preferencing in their pollination. So you can see here with a hoplitis, it's looking at 4 different types of flowers that it may be going and pollinating from, compared with a bombus, which is certainly more of a generalist that has a much broader palette of the different types of plants it will be visiting, down to maybe a Calliopsis, which is looking at maybe one of 2 different types of genus of plants that it's looking at. So, the work we're all doing to kind of, when we observe a bee, connect it, especially if it's visiting a plant, and having documentation around that really helps us understand this incredible diversity of bees, but also then how that diversity relates to the diversity of plants that are out there. So with that, Elliot, talk us through a little natural history.
Yes, thank you. And while Steve, if you could put a link to that last visual in the chat, Michael was asking about that. And also, while you were talking, Wendy asked how much damage leafcutter bees do to plants. So, it's a good question, and I think it's kind of hard to quantify how much damage they do. Generally, they're taking pieces of large fleshy leaves of plants like aspens and roses that have lots of leaves in general. So I would say it's not usually a concern from a pest point of view. We will talk later about how pesticides, especially like systemic insecticides, could be impacting the life cycles of some of those bees that rely on plant materials, and of course all of the pollen collecting that goes on.
And actually, I'll just add something to my question or comment, because I mean, I've seen plants in my yard where like every leaf has a chunk out of it, but it just made me realize that may not be the work of one bee, right? That could be the work of multiple bees, who leafcutter bees who've decided that that's a good, tasty morsel for, their activities.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that the pieces that a leafcutter bee is going to take are always have a nice clean edge because of those strong mandibles, whereas grasshopper damage or some of the other herb some of the other herbivores, insects may make a little messier, a little more of a mess of those leaves. So the life cycle of a solitary bee is mostly out of sight. And when we think about the bee that you see in front of you, and this is true for butterflies and actually lots of insects, when you think about the organism that you see on a flower or flying around as a very short snippet of their life. So usually we're talking about most of the year that they're spending as a larva or a pupating underground, and then only a few weeks maybe a couple months that they're spending as an adult out in nature. Next. So, oh, can you go back one, Steve? The that next slide is being kind of okay. Well, we'll keep going. So our ground nesting bees, which were it's about 70%, so think of it about 2/3, 3/4 of our bees are ground nesting. And what kind of soil they nest in can vary. Some of them like hard packed soil, nearly rock level of hardness. Some of them like sand dunes. It's really gonna vary on the habitat you're in. And the main point is that they just need some soil that's not paved over, not covered in weed cloth or thick mulch. And we'll talk a little more about the habitat elements later as well. Okay, I thought we skipped this one. So basically we have our ground nesting bees, about 2/3 of the bees. Then we have another third of the bees, minus the bumblebees and the honeybees, essentially, that are going to be our cavity nesting bees. So that can be in a yucca stalk, in a cut stem or a dry flower stalk, um, or in a tree or a log that's been bored out by beetles or some other insect. A lot of the smaller ones aren't necessarily gonna have um, enough energy to chew their own cavities. But like I have personally watched the large carpenter bees, the Xylocopa, chew into a yucca stalk, and they go in and then they kind of go up and they can make little nest cells along the way, and then it's a pretty safe place for their larvae to develop. Next. And then as far as our can you go back to the bumblebees? Oh, never mind. It's bouncing around on my screen. It's hot. So the bumblebees, and you saw about 20 species of bumblebees in Colorado, and actually you can find a lot of them in the Central Valley or in the Arkansas Valley. And it's a lot of them are segregated by altitude in Colorado. So down by the river and where a lot of the people live, you're going to see mostly the Hunt's bumblebee with the red band or orange band on it, and maybe some of the white shoulder bumblebees or Nevada bumblebees. And then as you go up, you start to get some of the forest species like Silvicola, and then even higher, you get some of the alpine species like Frigidus and Balteatus. And so at all these different altitudes, their life cycles are going to start at different times, and how many generations they can have or how many workers they can produce and how big their colony can get is going to vary. So when you're talking about those near to above tree line bumblebees, they can't really emerge until the snow melts up there, and they need to be finished with all of their reproduction before the snow starts falling again so they can be ready to hibernate. So the season up there is pretty short for them to uh, to start the colony with the queen. She lays the eggs for some workers, and then she works with those workers to keep laying more eggs, collecting more resources until they essentially run out of time and winter starts again. Next. So bumblebees love untidy areas. They like messiness. They like a place where they can have a nest and you won't notice it. So leaf litter, piles of sticks. Um, this can be above ground or below ground, like an old, it's an old rodent holes. But the big thing for them is they want to be able to protect their colony, and they do make kind of these little, you can see in that photo on the right, kind of these little cells that are like a honeycomb, but it's the bumblebee's version of that. So they're trying to protect those resources that they're gathering. Next. And then of course, our insects need flowers, and our bees need both high quality energy from nectar, and then high quality protein for their offspring from pollen. And then when we're talking about bees that are more specialist or more generalist, that comes down to which flowers they're going to tend to go to, and how their biology has developed over millions of years in terms of which those very specific associations in some cases where they are timing when they emerge from their nests to the flowering season of a specific plant, collecting as many resources off that plant as possible, and then that year's generation will pretty much be over with. And I think we're going to go back to Steve here, talk about some of our conservation issues.
I'll pick up. You got it. So given kind of the thought around what bees need, their natural history, the diversity, what are some of the things we need to be thinking about as to where the concerns are for their conservation, for their ability to be able to thrive in the spaces around us? And certainly a key threat there is just habitat loss. And sometimes that could be what we saw in the previous slide, truly the removal of habitat with the removal of all vegetation, the hardscaping of a site. And it might actually also, though, be adding in plants and vegetation that serves real no benefit for most of our pollinators or our bees. It has very little, if any, floral resources to it. So no ability to support the nectar, the pollen, and or the other chemicals of a plant that sometimes the bees need. So yeah, kind of the changing of our vegetation to non-native to plants that don't have floral capacities can be a problem. Pesticides can be a very direct and significant issue. This slide is showing some of the 50,000 bumblebees that were killed when a landscaper unfortunately treated a tree in Portland, Oregon, or several trees in Portland, Oregon, with a pesticide that then was in bloom, and the bumblebees were using that as a favored nectar and pollen source, and ended up, again, having this incredible loss of bumblebee life as part of an unfortunate and misinformed use of a pesticide at the wrong time and at a wrong place. And sometimes we don't even think about the locations that pesticides may be used in, but just in terms of some of our manicured landscapes and trying to keep a very aesthetic look to it and trying to keep our blooms looking their best, our plants looking their best, the application of those pesticides can be a very direct and real threat to the health and the safety, whether that's a direct loss of life of a pollinator or the reduction of their ability to actually go through their behaviors as healthily as they should. So kind of reduce their capacity to be able to function, to fly well, or be able to forage as long as they need to be able to provision a nest. So instead of, maybe able to maximizing the capacity to provision a nest, they're only being able to provide a few eggs and a few reserves for those eggs. Climate change, certainly a major issue. I think Elliot was touching base on a little bit on that, just with the thought around the connection between the timing of when flowers and floral resources available and the when the bees are on wing and kind of the support of a generation. So there's, certain threats that we, have to recognize that are putting our pollinators at risk. And then coming with that is then what can we do about those threats? How can we help make sure we're mitigating those? We're doing our best for conservation efforts. This is a graphic that was used with the Colorado pollinator study, and I think it really just helps put together that it was built off of a separate diagram and graphic that was put out, which was talking about 1,000 cuts, all the different ways and threats that are out there that affect the landscape of pollinators. And this is kind of recognizing that, yes, there are 1,000 different ways we can impact pollinators, but there's probably also a lot of different ways we can all collaborate and do work to help stitch solutions and conservation efforts to help and make hopefully some improvements in mitigating some of those threats, whether that's thinking about what we can do in our green spaces and connect more of our green spaces around our urban environments, to thinking about how we manage our grazing lands, to managing our natural areas. So a lot of different ways we can help to address some of those threats. One thought, that often comes up as well is beekeeping, in fact, helping us in our conservation efforts. And, as kind of Elliot kind of pointed out with the honeybee point is, unfortunately, it is really not equivalent to be thinking that as we're taking on beekeeping efforts with a honeybee, that we're actually, not really doing work of bee conservation. There's a lot of reasons and benefits to doing beekeeping, but those have to be kind of separated out and done with respect to know that there are implications for our native bees, and we need to manage those beekeeping practices in ways that help to reduce some of the competition or potential pathogen exposure that may happen to our native bees through those activities. Certainly a way that we can, help our conservation efforts is to provide habitat. So think about the entire life cycle of a bee. So think about how can we protect them from pesticides, provide nesting resources for them, flowers for foraging, and do the work in and around any of the spaces that we have the ability to touch, to see how we can kind of integrate different aspects of resources for them. So one of the key things we can do is to make sure we have our eye out on our natural areas, those areas that are already providing kind of the baselines for our bee populations, our pollinator populations. These are kind of the areas that provide, of course, the fundamental habitat for the diversity of our species. So it's incumbent on us all to look after these spaces with the greatest care. But then also think about where we have maybe less natural areas that can still hold quite important value to our bees and other pollinators. So thinking about wherever we have green spaces, where can we add green spaces? And in those spaces, then make sure we're adding in native plants where possible, and looking to, again, bare ground or woody vegetation, other things that may be able to make use of those wooded or green spaces as potential habitat for our pollinators and our bees. And we just don't often think about how more urban space may actually be beneficial, but it can be, in fact, to many of our bees. That connectivity can happen kind of through a little bit of a patchy network, but it can still play a very important role, where a vegetable garden in one site may be able to provide some level of floral and pollen resources that a bee can use, or maybe even a fly, and then pops over to another site where there's some bare ground that it's able to nest in, and maybe within some work that was done in a median in a roadway, and revegetation there with some native plants supporting, again, another area for the bees and the other pollinators to forage from. So in and around our spaces that we have, direct control, there's a lot we can do, even if they aren't the most natural of spaces. So what do we need to be thinking about for bees? Well, certainly it's, again, retain the natural features where they exist, where we can add or kind of retain both sometimes woody structure, shrubs, and other kind of woody features, but also that bare ground. So we're really looking not only about the floral benefits and resource needs of bees, but also some of those other structural needs within the bees. Within ground nesting, it doesn't oftentimes take a lot of space to do that. Sometimes just a little bare ground next to a rock or between, you know, a garden and a neighboring area, maybe if you're in a driveway, that little space can provide enough bare ground to support, you know, a ground nesting bee. So this little Agapostemon bee, sweat bee, was making use of my flower garden in the area where I didn't disturb it, and it was made great little nest, and was kind of joy for me to be able to watch as it went out and visited a lot of my plants in my gardens. So it may be something you can do some supplemental nest support by putting out nest blocks or nesting boxes, or do something similar where you're just taking an old log and drilling a variety of different size holes in it, maybe down to a 3/16 size up to a 3/8 diameter, to provide some of those nesting holes for many of our bees to be able to utilize. And it's not just the bees that'll utilize these spaces. Oftentimes too, there's many other of our pollinators. Our grass wasps will use any of those holes, and you can often, again, tell them if they're active using a nest block by the grass that's often plugging the entrance into one of those little holes. So, Elliot?
Thank you. And one of the best ways that you can benefit invertebrate communities as a whole in your garden is it's a very simple slogan: leave the leaves. Now, at least in New Mexico, I always tell people that I know it's a challenge to actually keep the leaves around, because we tend to have dry, windy falls, and I don't think Colorado's that different. So thinking about ways to pile up the leaves, maybe with some branches on top, or, you know, putting it under and around plants in places where they're not gonna just blow into your neighbor's yard and be a nuisance. But generally, keeping that organic material in the garden is good anyway for your plants, and then it also keeps any kind of insect that's trying to overwinter in those leaves. Next. And then so another part of this is the stem nesting bees, mostly are small carpenter bees and our masked bees that are going to be using, and these can be very skinny stems. We're talking like a eighth to a quarter of an inch opening is really all they need in a stem to either chew their way in, or if the stem is naturally drying out and hollowing in the middle from that pith, to make their nest in there. So essentially, wait on your garden cleanup until spring, or just don't clean up. Messy gardens are good for wildlife too. This can include a stick pile, which is you don't want to put it right next to your house for mice and rats if you're worried about that, but it can be great. I know when I piled up lots of cut branches and things in my backyard one year, the juncos were always hopping around in among the branches and kind of using it as shelter from the Cooper's hawks and the sharp-shinned hawks. So it's benefiting more than just pollinators. Next. And rock piles can also be an attractive part of a garden. You can incorporate this with, say, succulents or alpine plants that like the drainage of being around rocks and crevices, and also giving a chance for some of the both invertebrates and some of the reptiles to have places to sun and also shelter. Next. So more plants is better. I hope you figured that out by now. And it's good to try and plant in clumps, especially of multiple of one species. And this is a photo from Ptarmigan Lake up on Cottonwood Pass. It's a native thistle along that trail, and you can see a bumblebee coming into the flower. Thistles are great for a variety of bees and some of our pollinating beetles as well. They get kind of a bad rap because of some of our non-native thistles, like the bull thistle and Canadian thistle that people spend a lot of time mitigating against. But the native thistles are great pollinator plants. And in addition to having as many flowers as possible, we want those flowers to be spread out throughout the year. So thinking about spring to fall, what are those early blooming plants like Thermopsis, golden banner? And what are some of those late blooming plants like Chamisa and gumweed here, Grindilia? This is from my mom's neighborhood in northern Buena Vista with a little diadasia bee after a little afternoon rainstorm. So the bee was caught out in the rain and kind of had to wait there to dry off so she could fly again. And gives you an idea of the size of some of these bees relative to those flowers. And they just grow all along the dirt roads. If you go off towards Harvard Lakes in the late summer and early fall, they tend to be little mounds of Grindilia all the way up, and bees, beetles, flies, even seen crickets, tree crickets singing in those bushes in the evening. So just one of many great native plants. And here's a bunch of other great native plants. I tried to pick photos that I'd taken around the Arkansas Valley and central Colorado. So we've got Opuntia polyacantha, plains prickly pear with the small round pads and the long white spines, Penstemon whipplianus, yarrow, a fleabane erigeron, and cat's eye gentian. That one was up near Leadville on a backpacking trip with my mom actually, and there's one of those higher alpine bumblebees, and fireweed, and I think the last one was either a buttercup or a potentia, a cinquefoil, one of those type flowers. But just gives you, there's lots of beautiful plants in the area. These are all ones that I've seen pollinators visiting and bloom throughout the year, different colors, different sizes, different textures. We all want our gardens to have all of that aesthetic quality for both ourselves and the wildlife that's visiting it. And just some more photos of native plants. We have some arnica on the right, and if I'm wrong, correct me. I think it was arnica, and then on the left, a prairie thistle, Cirsium canescens, with both a little beetle in the front and then one of our leafcutter bees. So garden plants is another phrase maybe for ornamentals, things like lavenders and daffodils and tulips and hawthorns and all maybe your typical big box stores or your Eastern gardens, things that look nice. I think a lot of the culinary herbs fall in this category as being nice to grow either in pots or in the ground, and they're things that we want around. They smell nice, they look nice. And certainly we're not discouraging you from any of those plants. And as members of the Native Plant Society, you probably already have a good balance of those plants in your yard. What we do generally want to avoid are some of the cultivars, some of the plants that have been bred or selected for in such a way that they lose a lot of the value to our pollinators. So this can be some of the roses and geraniums and hydrangeas and all kinds of garden plants that look really cool, but some of them end up being sterile, or they don't have very much nectar anymore. And the wild version of a given plant, like a wild rose or a wild type rose, is probably going to be more attractive to pollinators than a hybrid rose. And chemicals are always something that comes up in gardening, and this is, it's for a variety of reasons. One of the things that we want to avoid in our vegetable gardens, for example, or if you have fruit trees, you're going to manage those a little more carefully because of some of the effort you're putting into them, what you're trying to get out of that, which is understandable. We have to think about how those chemicals might spread, might drift throughout the landscape, and this can be in your yard, in your neighbor's yard, and things that, this can be pre-emergence and herbicides, insecticides, pesticides. Not a lot of the chemicals on the market are tested on native pollinators beyond honeybees. And So we don't really know what doses affect them, and in how these chemicals are maybe interacting with the bees, if they're ending up, if they're washing off your plant into the soil and then the bees digging their nest there. So as few as possible, as careful as possible, and thinking about alternatives. So this is something, the neonicotinoids have been a big topic of discussion in recent years. And if you haven't heard this word, just next time you're at the nursery, ask them where they get their plants, who they buy them from, how they're grown, and if they have any information about whether those plants are treated as seeds or seedlings with these systemic insecticides, because they can persist in the plant to keep those nursery plants looking nice, for when you buy them, but then they may also make those plants essentially toxic to all the insects in your garden. And one of the things we can do instead is, a buzzword here is integrative pest management, alternatives to chemical use. And ladybugs are one of the poster childs of that. There's a lot of beneficial insects, and there's pretty good information that Xerces has on their website about that, and I think on YouTube as well. And it's a whole range of animals, from bush tits and goldfinches that like eating small soft-bodied insects like aphids and scale, and spiders, and some of predatory beetles and lacewings and different kinds of flies, and of course the ladybugs, which this is one of our more common ladybugs, but there's actually a pretty wide diversity of ladybugs in different shapes and sizes, and which ecological niches they fill as well. And we might talk a little more about that at the iNaturalist presentation, or at least give you some more information about how to identify and find more information on these different beneficial insects you might see in your garden. So one thing you can do to support pollinators and support the Xerces Society, frankly, is if you give a donation and get a nice yard sign, and you put it out, and it lets your neighbors know what you're doing with your garden. It's a bit of a conversation piece and a bit of yard art. So I definitely recommend it. And this is where we advertise first for another Xerces staff member, Amy Dolan, is going to be presenting in 2 weeks to the Colorado Native Plant Society about the Bumblebee Atlas, the Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas. So that is a project where volunteers go out and collect non-lethally. They take pictures of bumblebees while they're captive, and then they let them go, to help document bumblebees in different parts of the Western US. And then come back again at the beginning of April and learn about iNaturalist and maybe some about Bumblebee Watch and Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper in terms of ways that you can document what you're seeing in your garden and learn more about those insects that might come to your flowers. And then we'll pretty much wrap up here. Put in a plug for both the books that Xerces has. I think most of them are available on Amazon, as well as the free publications that Xerces has on their website, which includes plant lists and fact sheets and handouts and flyers and all the research that they do that gets published. There's pretty much links to everything you could want on the Xerces website, as well as if you need new podcasts to listen to, certainly give this one a shot. There's been episodes about a whole range of topics from butterflies to jumping spiders to bee conservation and monarch counts in California. And then Xerces is also pretty active on YouTube, and especially during COVID, they were broadcasting and recording a lot of their talks similar to this one. So there's information on a wide variety of topics, including the beneficial insects and butterfly conservation and whatever you might want. So definitely give that a look if you'd like to learn more. And you can always follow Xerces on social media or go to the website to sign up for the newsletter if you want any of that kind of information. And then we have to mention that it is a donor-funded nonprofit, and especially with the political situation that has been in the news, where some of the federal funding may be more at risk than usual, it's really helpful if you're able to support efforts like this for invertebrate conservation. So with that, I think we are ready for more questions. If anyone wants to put them in the chat, or at this point, you could just unmute and let us know what you're thinking.
Yeah, and I want to give both Steve and Elliot a sort of virtual round of applause here for a very well, I'll say, traveled talk across many topics and a lot of really good information. And so, yes, I invite anybody at this point. If you have a question, you want to raise your hand, you want to just unmute yourself, go for it.
Hey, while people are gearing up, I just want to offer an idea. Last year, I tried to get people to consider every time I use iNaturalist to take a picture of a flower, there's always an invertebrate in the picture. And so just reposting that observation again, zooming in on the invertebrate, same picture, and just label it invertebrate. And then you get all these entomologists who look at your bug pictures, and we contribute to the overall community science related to this.
Good point.
That's a great point, Maggie. And I think the other benefit there is it really helps us understand in our own region what pollinators are visiting, what plants. And so I think it provides that benefit to the greater body of information. But as we do work to understand which plants are maybe important to certain bees, we can maybe capture that more carefully for what's appropriate for whether it's the Arkansas Valley or Colorado more generally. So incredibly important.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say, I'll kick this off just as a little additional discussion, because I know for, people who are tuned in, I mean, some of the burning questions really are, okay, the nuts and bolts here, right? How do I, how do I pick plants or how do I get stuff to grow, particularly in our area, which is a fairly desolate area in some sense, right? We have very sandy, rocky soils. We have very little organic matter, very little nutrients. And people are often coming from some other places where they're not accustomed to struggling to get things to grow, right? We have limited water. In fact, the natives don't even need that much water. But, one thing that does come to mind is, I've witnessed Elliot over 6+ years take an Albuquerque yard, which was rocks. When he bought his house, it was just rocks. And now it is, wall to wall native plants, and the 1,600 plus species of insects he's identified, many of those have come along with the plants. And so I guess, Elliot and Steve, what are your thoughts here about how do you actually get native plants in your yard and get them growing?
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. First, I want to say in terms of the appreciation of invertebrates like Maggie was talking about, we also have there's also a large proportion of nocturnally active insects that includes pollinators like moths and a whole range of insects. So in the summertime, when it's nice, warm, calm evening, and you have your porch lights on, go out and look and take your phone with you and maybe a flashlight and take some pictures of whatever's up on your stucco or under your lights or even on the ground around the lights. And you can see a whole range of interesting insects. And it can certainly be a challenge to get things to grow. I would say there's maybe two camps in terms of how people cultivate land to try and improve it and add more plants, which is there's the trying to leave it wild and encouraging those native volunteers like the wind-blown seeds and some of the things that the birds poop out and not trying to do too much, essentially low disturbance. And then the opposite is trying to amend your soil and create microhabitats and shade and irrigate and you can potentially grow a wider range of things there and maybe bigger, healthier plants there. But it's certainly more energy resource intensive. So looking, going out and looking last summer when I was up there with my mom, we went out to this road cut along that's I think 24, right? The
Yeah,
highway that goes
24,
back
yeah.
towards the
Mhm.
springs.
Yeah.
And just on the east side of Trout Creek Pass, there's a little road cut and just loaded with wildflowers, penstemon and um, buckwheat and paintbrush and a whole range of things just growing on this little rocky, sunny slope, no shade, no trees, side of the road. And so if they can do that in nature and you can find ways to mimic that in your garden, you can have certainly a whole range of plants potentially grow. You just have to be able to get the seeds in the first place. And I'm sure the Native Plant Society has lots of great resources on where to buy those seeds. So that's a bit of my answer. I know it doesn't address everything. Let Steve give his 2 cents, and then we also have a couple new questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. I think you covered it well there. I would emphasize, I think a point you were saying is just to look around the areas and especially in the kind of the open spaces or ideally natural spaces nearby where you live and what's growing well there. And oftentimes think about those may be good places to start with what might actually be acceptable to the soil conditions you have. And then think about certain plants that they may be able to kind of withstand a variety of different conditions and are fairly hardy. So they may be some of the first ones you want to get established to at least try to provide some stabilization that may help some other plants that may be a little harder to establish, have a little protection against some of the other more weedy species. And that may give you a kind of a footprint. So I always think about, again, getting some of the sunflowers in an area, even though they can be a little aggressive, you may have to manage them. Starting some things that are established, if you can get the gum weeds established. There's some plants, the Mexican hat, the coneflowers. There's a number of different plants that are fairly acceptable of sometimes some rougher conditions, but can really make a big difference for our pollinators.
Yeah, and thinking about that context of in our gardens, we tend to like things evenly spaced and spread out and neat. And in nature, the trees and the bigger shrubs can often act as nurse plants for smaller shrubs getting started, or some of the tender annuals that would get blasted out in full sun, but they're able to grow in the shade of something. So there's lots of things you can try along the way. And Charles asked, what is a typical range of a bee? How far does it forage? So there's some good research on that, and Steve might be able to find a link or at least pass it along later. But it really depends on the size of the bee. So the native bees that are an eighth to a quarter of an inch, their foraging range, they might not go beyond a couple 100 feet in their life. And we're talking about the size of a yard or a block of houses, maybe, at least a city block. And then those larger bees, bumblebees and carpenter bees and honeybees, have been known to travel miles. The honeybees are a bit of an extreme case because of their hive setup. But even the carpenter bees and bumblebees certainly will spread out over a large area to find the best resources. We also have a question from Ronnie. I was told that bee houses are dangerous to native bees because they attract bee predators and holes aren't cleaned out. What does Xerces recommend? So there is always a balance in terms of a managed habitat like that. There's a lot of information out there, especially for people who are specifically focusing on mason bees, in terms of how they prepare their houses and how they clean out the tubes and put the cocoons in the fridge and all these things. I think the main thing does happen, that if you have a bee house that is being used over and over, you can have some residual diseases and fungal and mold problems, as well as, say, spiders or wasps taking up residence there as for easy meals. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're dangerous or detrimental to native bees. So it's it's a fun thing to try, and you have to site it correctly on your property in terms of what direction it faces, giving it some shelter. I think usually facing the morning sun is better, and trying not to have it where it gets baked in the afternoon heat. But it's something that I think is still being learned about as well, because it's not something that's been as popular in the past, the bee houses, and specifically focusing on those native cavity nesting bees. So there's still research to be done there in terms of how effective they are and how to best manage that.